civilization is being sacrificed for the opportunity of a very small number of people.
We urgently need financial, political and social innovations that enable us to overcome this structural dependency on growth.
We need to change the system. This isn't cleaning up the beaches in the case of plastic a little bit faster. That's vital, that has to be done. But you need to stem the flow.
Go Simone explores sustainable change and the women inspiring it. Who are they? What made them who they are? How do they read the world they live in? Our guests share their story, roots, passions and hopes for the future. They tell us more about the alternatives and strategies they developed to tackle climate change. In an interview with the Ephemera Journal, George Monbiot, a British columnist and writer, says, "My experience suggests that the way you get companies to change is to work against them. What companies are extremely afraid of and will go to great lengths to avoid is protest, direct action, public embarrassment and exposure. What they are very happy with, and they have an infinite capacity to absorb, is dialogue and discussion and people attempting to work for positive change on the inside." Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, a group renowned since it first took the polluters to court to ban the pesticide DDT in the 1960s in the US, is precisely doing the latter, taking an inclusive and pragmatic approach with the polluting industries to address climate change and find scalable solutions with them. They currently work with major corporations, Walmart, FedEx, McDonald's, and more, describing those partnerships as unexpected. They say work with partners makes us stronger and more effective. This thinking is based on the idea that we need everyone on board to seize the opportunities where they are to do better. So, do we need everyone? Are those strategies effective? What are the roadblocks faced by those who try to implement them? And ultimately, can we create a new paradigm with the old one? Our Simone today is Aoife O'Leary. She is Director of International Climate at EDF. She's a lawyer and has specialized on the environmental impacts of international shipping and aviation. She's also a board member of Rethinking Economics, a charity campaigning to reform the economics curriculum in the UK. With Aoife, we talked about growing up in a union household, the murky world of shipping, the potential of renewable energy export, navigating complexity, the right way to implement carbon pricing and what to do with the revenues generated, changing the narrative, and having the right incentives. Hi, Aoife. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
My first traditional question in Go Simone is about your childhood. I'm just curious to know where you grew up and what kind of childhood you had.
I'm from Dublin in Ireland, which I guess a lot of people will figure out from my name, which is Aoife O'Leary, which means bright in Irish. I had a really great childhood, both my parents teachers, and we lived in, I guess, somewhat suburban Dublin. At least I think of it as a suburbs now that I live in London. But at the time, I thought of it as quite central Dublin. I was always super studious. Mainly, I guess there was always an expectation in my house that you would do well in school, and I did. But it was never enforced or anything like that. It was a really quite idyllic childhood in many ways.
Is there a souvenir you have from your childhood or something, a highlight?
My family have kind of a trade union background. My granddad was involved, both my parents were involved. They actually met through a teachers' trade union. So I guess I always kind of grew up thinking I was going to save the world in some capacity. So like in school, I set up Amnesty International group, and we did fundraising one year where we got into the Guinness Book of World Records for the largest Chinese whispers ever. We got the whole school out, got the local press down and stuff. So I was always doing, I guess, things like that. because I originally wanted to go into human rights. And it was later on I took a turn towards working in the environmental arena.
How would you qualify your relationship with nature?
There's two aspects for me, because both my parents were teachers. We took long summer holidays, which was great. And every year we went to either France or Germany or somewhere like that. My mum was a language teacher. So we spent a lot of time outdoors and seeing other places, but we also spent a lot of time in Donegal, which is up in the north of Ireland in Inishowen, which to me is one of the most beautiful places in the world, and spent a lot of time on beaches and things like that. So just growing up, but I had a great access to it, so I just didn't really think about it very much. Now I live in London, I really have to make the time to go out into the country and like get that green. Like, aspect for me is animals. I'm a huge dog lover. Everyone who knows me will know that. I have my little dog Rue sitting beside me. There was definitely a big part of me that wanted to do something to do with animals as well. And I think that's a lot of what the draw to environmentalism.
How did you personally become aware of climate change? Was there a tipping point, or was it a progressive realization?
You know, I actually remember the exact moment I learned about it. Now, I can't guarantee I hadn't heard about it before, but I remember being in geography lesson when I was 11, and they just taught us about the greenhouse gas effect, the way, you know, the sun's rays come in and get trapped. And then this has been building over years, and actually now there's well, at the time it was global warming was what we called it, right, rather than climate change. It's getting progressively worse, and, you know, I just absorbed it as a fact, and it was fascinating to me. I guess I've always been very into science and maths. Like I say, my mum was a language teacher, but my dad was a maths and economics teacher, and I very much have taken after him in my love of maths and economics. I've just never been very good at languages, but that science aspect of it was fascinating to me. And that was also another draw of working in the environmental sphere.
Why did you decide to study law and later on economics?
So I decided to do law because at that stage I was still hoping to be a human rights lawyer. But then when I was doing my training contract in Dublin, I worked in one of the big corporate law firms. And it's one of the only ways to qualify while also getting paid in Dublin. I never really wanted to do corporate law, as they figured out as well. How you do it is you do training in different departments. And one of the departments I trained in was the environmental department. Now, because it was a big corporate law firm, we weren't acting for what I would term the environmental side. So it was fascinating. And we did do some really big wind farm deals. This was back when the Green Party were originally in power in Ireland. Well, they were part of a coalition. They'd never had that much power. But there was an increasing awareness around climate change. And this was as, I guess, a lot of Ireland's renewable energy was starting to get going. I just found, I guess, that environmental side fascinating. And so that's when I decided that's what I wanted to do more than human rights, because the challenge of climate change is just ginormous. And I thought I had some of the right skills that were needed. And so then I went off and did a master's in environmental law. And I ended up working in a NGO in Brussels called Transport and Environment on aviation and shipping and their climate emissions. And that's kind of been my specialty ever since. But the reason I then turned to economics as well was because what I did when I was working for Transport and Environment was essentially speak to politicians in the European Parliament, European Council, and the European Commission. And you would say to them, well, aviation and shipping both have this huge impact on the environment, and we need to put in place regulations that will reduce that impact. But immediately all of them would say, oh, but they're vital to the economy. What about jobs? Or if you put any kind of policy in place, it will impact on jobs. And both industries have very good narratives about why that is true. So the shipping industry always talks about how it is the servant of world trade and it has brought development around the world. Now, that's not entirely untrue. And I always kind of knew there was something dodgy about it, but I could never really figure out what the right language was to fight it, I guess. So I did an economics degree. And what I learned that economics is kind of made up. So from my law background, where you are taught that everything is to be questioned, everything is to be analysed, and almost everything you're told, there's at least 5 different stories to it, right? So you never accept anything on face value, and you really have to dig and find the truth as such. Whereas in economics, you are told this is the way it is. And a lot of it, I just immediately sat there and went, that doesn't make sense to me. Like, you're immediately taught all government spending is dead weight, so you should minimise government. Like, that is a standard line that you're taught without explaining why or being allowed to question it. And I was immediately like, that makes no sense to me, because I can see government does lots of really great things, from health, from schools, all kinds of stuff like that. But I guess what I fundamentally learned about economics was your answer to any economic problem depends on what assumptions you put in. So if you assume that aviation is good for the economy, then you do a report looking at how it's good for the economy, and it turns out it is very good for the economy. And that was literally what the industry was producing in terms of these reports. And so I learned very quickly how to look at the assumptions behind it and question it. I don't think anyone needs an economics degree to do that, but I guess it took me that much. And maybe it was because of my law degree, and I was trying to figure out where the basis for all of this came from and the underlying truth. But I discovered there isn't really any, which then also led me to question all of economics teaching. And I have ended up being chair of a charity called Rethinking Economics, which is a wonderful group that campaigns to change the economics curriculum so that's more pluralist. So, but you would also be taught economics that looks at feminism and racial theory and the environment, very importantly, and doesn't just produce these economists that see pure growth for growth's sake and markets and the industry as always being right and good for society as a whole.
Since 2018, you are the director of the Environmental Defense Fund in the London office. Could you tell us more about your role and what EDF is trying to do?
I am a director of international climate, and my focus at the moment is on international shipping. And I guess what I am really trying to do in international shipping is bring in global policy that will reduce shipping's emissions. So I'm based in London, where the International Maritime Organization is, which is a UN body that regulates international shipping. Shipping is a very hidden industry. We don't really think about it. But if you look around, wherever anyone is listening to this, probably the chair you're sitting on has been shipped from somewhere else, or parts of it have, or ships run on some of the dirtiest in the world. It is quite often used to either tarmac the roads or ships. It has been cleaning up. The amount of sulfur fuel has been reduced quite a bit, but there's a lot more to be done, definitely in terms of the climate emissions anyway. But when you look at where shipping can go in the future, what we think we'll see is fuels made from renewable energy. So that would be some kind of hydrogen carrier, for example, ammonia, or maybe even hydrogen itself directly into fuel cells in the ship. But you can make from essentially renewable energy, water and air. Places around the world that have large renewable energy capacity could soon be really big producers of shipping fuel, which is really exciting because at the moment there's about 8 countries that really control the entire shipping fuel market, but this will blow that wide open and make it much more democratic. A lot of them at the moment don't have a huge amount of investment in renewable energy, partially because they don't have enough demand. And another thing is international shipping at the moment essentially pays no taxes anywhere in the world.
How come?
It's partially because it is an international industry. If one country taxes it, then you've got a question about, well, how do you do that without driving shipping somewhere else? Shipping is a very murky world, going to all of the flag states, etc. If you look at the Beirut blast that they just had, that blast was definitely due to negligence on the part of the Lebanese government. But if you look at how that substance ended up in the port, there's some really interesting articles about the shipping world behind that and how the ship was owned by one party and the crew that didn't get paid and were stuck on the ship for a long time, and how the ship was essentially not fit for purpose, sunk. It's really come to the fore because of that explosion. But I guess when you regulate a ship, every ship flies a flag. The flag that it flies quite often has nothing to do with either where the ship was built, where it sails from, who owns it, where the crew are from. So the largest flag states in the world are Panama, Marshall Islands, and Liberia. And it's fascinating to me, the history of how flag states have developed. And a lot of it has come from US. The United States back in the 20s banned alcohol all across the United States, prohibition. And there was a case to ask whether if you're selling alcohol on a US ship, whether that is also part of the United States. And the answer was yes. So that essentially started a whole new industry, which was out flagging ships. And so a new registry was set up in various different countries where you could then say these US ships weren't really US ships. And it's also been used to bring a lot of revenue into different countries. So unfortunately, the Liberian flag was linked to a lot of revenue came in while Liberia was going through a civil war and was used for very dodgy purposes. So shipping as an industry has a lot of dodgy things going on. And then if you are just stopping in a country's port, if you're buying your fuel and that country puts a tax on that fuel, then you're going to buy your fuel somewhere else because ships can travel for months and months without needing to take on more fuel. So that kind of prevents that as well. And California at one stage did put in a fuel tax, and all that meant was they just didn't sell any fuel. What you really need is the entire world through the International Maritime Organization or a large portion of countries, so the European Union could potentially do it, to say, okay, well, we're going to put some kind of measure on all ships that call at our ports, which they can do under port state control. And once a ship stops in a country's port, you can essentially impose any regulation because ports are national territory. So as long as the ship has come willingly into your territory, you can then say, okay, you have come into my territory, you must comply with my law the same way as anyone complies with the law of whatever country they go to. Legally, it's incredibly easy to do, though the industry and some countries raise legal questions sometimes, but they're actually political will questions. And that is one of the ways that they kind of try to deflect and stop regulation that we need for the climate.
To make change, who are your best allies at the moment? Is it the industry? Is it the international bodies that you mentioned?
There's a number of different levers and, I guess, allies. So for sure, the International Maritime Organization is a big ally because they realise shipping has a bad reputation in terms of climate as well. And in 2018, they agreed an initial greenhouse gas strategy. The strategy is to reduce emissions by at least 50% compared to 2008 by 2050. So that was quite ambitious. It's not ambitious enough to stay in line with the temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. And we're pushing very hard to renew that. But at the same time, the International Maritime Organization realizes that you're going to have some very strict regulations in place to ensure that that gets achieved. And they want to get that in place because they have this strategy and now they're kind of on the hook to make sure we achieve it. So they are very much an ally. Similarly, parts of the industry are allies. Definitely there are parts of the industry that are just not interested. But also, again, parts of the shipping industry realize that this is their reputation. And there's a really interesting group that we're part of now called the Getting to Zero Coalition, which is an industry group that has come together and said, okay, we're going to get a zero-emission vessel on a deep sea route by 2030. So that would be a vessel that runs on hydrogen or ammonia or something like that, that the International Maritime Organization allows in industry and NGO observers. So you have the bodies of the industry. And quite often, unfortunately, what is the lowest common denominator from the industry being represented. That is changing somewhat, and definitely groups like the Getting to Zero Coalition have really facilitated that ambitious voice in the industry. And so I do my best to try and amplify that. But in addition to that, what is really important is a number of countries. So I spoke before about this opportunity to drive investment into countries around the world through producing renewable energy and turning that into shipping fuel. So a lot of countries have realized that this is actually great. And a lot of developing countries are thinking, I wonder if I could actually become a renewable energy exporter through turning it into something like hydrogen and exporting it to, say, Europe or the United States. So a great example, we recently had a webinar where the Minister of Energy from Chile spoke, because that's how engaged and that level of engagement you have, because they really do see that can really support their economy. But in addition to those countries that see this as an economic opportunity, of course, there's another group of countries that are just fighting for their survival. And these are the most important, I guess, because we're looking at Pacific Island states, for example, that are disappearing. It's life or death for them. And in shipping, the Marshall Islands is one of the biggest flag states for shipping. So they are a very powerful force in the International Maritime Organization to push for greater emissions reductions. A coalition of small island states that are really, really pushing ambition and the agenda.
The International Maritime Organization that you mentioned had managed to put regulations in place so that the emissions of sulfur could decrease. And in doing so, it seems that those regulations have favored another type of energy, which is natural gas, which in itself might be less harmful to human health than conventional fuel oil, but that creates methane, and it would be a false good solution. It's actually a solution that a lot of countries go in, including Australia. There's a lot of push to go to develop natural gas instead of renewable energy. Is there some things that you are currently doing to try to influence that shift, the shift from natural gas instead of actually considering renewable energy? We could also talk about the fact that renewable energy is also extractive in its own way, that it relies on rare earth, etc., in itself creating other type of problems. So how are you approaching all that as an organization at EDF?
All of those things are big issues. And I guess what I would say up front is, unfortunately, there's very rarely a perfect solution to any environmental problem. But having said that, there are solutions that are almost perfect. And so those are the ones we go for as much as possible. The switch to gas, so LNG in the industry, is very problematic. Unfortunately, what the International Maritime Organization did was they separated out traditional air pollutants that harm health and also the environment from the climate emissions. Whereas really what you need to do is look at it in the round rather than do one and then the other. And unfortunately, that has allowed this opening for the industry to push LNG. And you're right, the methane emissions are incredibly problematic and damaging. And so what we're advocating is full life cycle assessment of all fuels. So what that means is we are not pushing for one particular fuel. Now, I mentioned ammonia and hydrogen as examples of fuels that could be the future. They are produced from renewable energy, but you can also produce them actually from gas as well. So that would be as problematic as using the gas directly in the ship. Now, you have no emissions from the ship itself, but you would have those emissions on land as you produce the fuel. So that is obviously, from an environmental perspective, completely pointless, right? If all you do is move the emissions from the ship onto land, then you've done nothing. And so we are very clear that any regulation on fuels, or if you have a carbon price, you need to take into account life cycle emissions. And that then should not just look at CO2, it should also look at methane and all other greenhouse gas emissions to the full production of that fuel, whether that's from gas, renewable energy. If we're talking about biofuels, it could be from crops. you also need to look at indirect effects. So the classic is through biofuels, where you knock down forests to produce your fuel, or you use land that had been used for food production, and then that food production gets moved somewhere else and then in turn causes deforestation. And I mean, all of this sounds quite complicated, but it has been looked at for many, many years. And there's been a number of false starts in shipping where some of the air pollution regulations do favour LNG. Similarly, we have EU regulations that favour biofuels that don't necessarily bring climate benefits at all. But everyone is becoming smarter. Hopefully, all of the politicians will also realise that we need to be smarter about these things. It's a complicated thing, unfortunately. There's no easy solution, but just because it's hard, that doesn't mean that we should stop or not do it. It's hard, but it's very worth doing.
What about the carbon pricing? And I'm thinking of the cap and trade system specifically. Do you think it's a good lever? There's a pretty good consensus amongst international institutions, the UN, the European Union, that is the best path towards carbon neutrality, and that it would enable us to progress fast. Is EDF advocating for that? And what are the roadblocks at the moment for implementation?
Carbon pricing is a very interesting tool and something I definitely advocate for. And EDF as an organisation has a background in carbon markets, and it's really kind of been EDF's thing for a long time. And so definitely I agree it's a really important tool that's been used. What I would like to see, however, is those carbon markets tightened. So if we're talking about a cap and trade market, we need to make sure that that cap is in line with where we need to get to on the Paris temperature goals. Unfortunately, we don't really have that anywhere. The European Union emissions trading system is the largest one in the world, and it has done some really great things. However, it has a long history that for a long time it had very low prices and was having almost no impact. So I think the thing with carbon pricing you have to be aware of is, yes, it's a good tool, but you have to look at how you implement it, right? It's not just always a good tool. It also depends on how tight the cap is, exactly what is in it. In terms of shipping, definitely it's a really important option. And as I spoke about before, shipping doesn't pay any taxes at the moment. And so if you have either the world through the IMO or a regional body coming together and saying, okay, we're going to put price on all emissions of the last journey to and from whatever port it is, or if you're doing it worldwide, you do it on a different basis because then you're including all emissions. But that could be a really, really important tool. If it is on the basis of a cap, as I said, it has to be in line with the Paris Agreement. If you are just putting a carbon levy in place, then you need to make sure that that levy is high enough to do a number of things, one of which is drive the switch to alternative fuels. So if it's too low, then unfortunately you're not really doing anything. The other thing that I think we need to take into account is what you do with that revenue. One of the things that we have thought about when we looked at the shipping industry is the large ships out there last for 20 to 30 years. So they're long-lived assets. Building ships is incredibly expensive. It's really capital intensive. So we have looked at other industries that were similar and said, okay, well, what has driven change in those industries? The first large wind farms or the first large solar farms cost a huge amount of money to set up and were not cost effective compared to building another coal-fired power plant, 20, 30 years ago. But the way that whole industry got going was there was a small charge on everyone's electricity bill, which went into a pot that was used to subsidize those large wind farms, large solar farms, and that really de-risked the investment. And that is what we think would be really important for the shipping industry as well. Because if you're the first ship owner to build one of these zero emission vessels, it's going to be incredibly expensive compared to a standard vessel. And why are you going to do that, right? You need to have some kind of incentive. And we think using a carbon price to drive the switch to alternative fuels, so quite a high carbon price, but also then using that money to subsidize to make sure that we get the zero emission vessels on the water is really important. Those climate vulnerable countries, so for example, Pacific Islands, what really we should be doing with a portion of that money as well is looking at supporting them and seeing how we can use climate finance to help them as well. Unfortunately, there's very rarely a silver bullet.
We've seen some investors recently, so major investors, Blackwater and those big companies, pulling out of fossil fuel investments. Is it a trend that you are also observing in the shipping industry?
We have. So in shipping, we have the Poseidon principles, which were announced last year, which is shipping financiers getting together and saying, okay, we are only going to finance ships that are on this trajectory to eliminating their emissions. Now that needs to be expanded more because not all ship financiers are in it, and you need to really make sure everyone is in it, or else you can essentially get your dirty ship finance somewhere else. And I think it is also just a reputational thing that I've kind of spoken about before, and big finance houses don't want to be seen to be funding dirty industries.
Do you find the main drive is still image? When you talk about reputation, it sounds like, it's all about image. So it's not an actual concern of those investors who are just humans and they will face the consequences of the climate change as well.
For those who are going to be impacted by climate change, especially some of the countries who are going to suffer really bad effects, and I'm not talking about Pacific Islands, there are other countries, and I will talk to them and say, we really need about emissions. They're like, oh yeah, but if the cost of shipping increases, then that's bad for my economy because I have to export, whatever it is. And that's definitely a real concern. However, if you put quite a high carbon price on shipping, the amount that shipping would actually be more expensive by is very small. But at the same time, those countries, they're concerned about this small change in the price of shipping, but don't seem to be very concerned about the fact that their entire agriculture production is going to have to change, that they're going to suffer more storms, et cetera, et cetera. And similarly, just focusing on the shipping industry itself, ports by definition are at sea level. And with all of the different storms, sea level rises, et cetera, that's a huge infrastructure investment that is going to be wiped out. In some cases, where exactly we're looking in the next 10 to 20 years. Similarly, if you think about the people who are on the ships, the shipping industry is very dangerous anyway. I already kind of spoke about ships sailing that really shouldn't be sailing. But if you think about seafarers and increased storms at sea, etc., it's just going to have a huge impact. But unfortunately, that narrative doesn't really exist. And it's not really been something that I have seen. It's something we're very interested in at EDF, and we're looking at doing a study, because one of the things as well, when I speak to these countries or the industry and I talk about, carbon pricing, for example, and in their heads, I think imposing a carbon price on shipping compared to the status quo. But that's not the comparison, right? The comparison is you put a carbon price on shipping, or you do whatever your regulation is, compared to sea level rise, increased storms, more sinking of ships, etc., right? The status quo doesn't exist. Business as usual means millions of people will die. It's terrifying, and I try not to think about it in many ways. EDF's tagline is finding the ways that work. And and this is me being very cynical, but I will use whatever argument I think will get us to the right regulations. And and that's my job. When I talk to these countries, I have to understand what their interests are, what would move, what's the most persuasive argument, etc.
It sounds a bit weird in a way that the shipping industry itself doesn't think that the climate change will disrupt their business and their operations enough, that it's in their best interest to fight against climate change, because from a business perspective, they might lose way more economically from the consequences of climate change if they don't future-proof further their operations. And as you said, the ability to mitigate the disruption. I guess it's a reflection on the general denying of the reality of climate change. I was wondering what you thought about climate change denial And one of the explanations that's often given to the general public and business denying the reality of climate change and not acting on it is that people tend to believe that innovation and technology will come at the rescue. It's the case with hydrogen. It's not completely false, like it might at some point come at the rescue, but we are not there yet. And at the same time, we are in a climate emergency, scientists say. So what's your views on this? Do you feel it's a belief which is extremely powerful, that innovation and tech in the shipping industry, and also what you observe around you?
I guess I haven't seen so much of it in the shipping industry, because you're right in that we don't have the hydrogen ships. There are small pilot projects being built. So it seems more real, I guess. I see it a lot in the aviation industry, I guess, because there's less near-term reduction possibilities there. But in shipping, there's also a lot of near-term reduction you can do even if you don't switch your fuel. So, for example, you can slow down because there's a cubic relationship. Because you're going through water rather than air, there's a lot more resistance. So as you slow down, the amount of fuel you use reduces dramatically. And there's a lot of efficiency things you can do in shipping. And it's really interesting that the shipping industry, as most industries that use oil, talk about fuel as being one of their biggest inputs. And so obviously they will maximize their efficiency, but they haven't at all. And it's a weird standard economics would tell you, obviously they will reduce their fuel use to the extent possible. But a lot of times they just don't. And that's kind of a really interesting thing again about the shipping industry and its makeup, because the people who own the ships aren't necessarily the ones that actually run them, and they're not the ones that are putting cargo on the ships. And quite often it's the people who are putting cargo on the ships that pay for the fuel, but they have no control over how much fuel you use. So there's that split incentive. It would be nice to believe that technology will come and save us all. And to a certain extent, it has over time. We've obviously seen, I talked about wind farms before. If you go back and look at the projections for the cost of wind energy, it has come down much, much, much faster than we projected. So that's been great, but we can't rely on that for sure. The only thing we can rely on are really what we have today. And in that sense, you have to go maximum of regulation now. And I do find that very frustrating in the shipping industry, where they're talking about, oh yeah, maybe we'll put in a carbon price in 5 or 10 years time. And I'm like, in 5 or 10 years time, that's, we need to do now today.
Coming back to the power of regulations and law, very recently there's a collective of NGOs and citizens which have proposed a new climate and ecological emergency bill to the UK Parliament. We've also seen the rise of criminalizing ecocide through international law in the political debate in France, in the UK. What do you think of those moves?
Definitely. And I want to add to that as well. We recently had a Supreme Court win in Ireland. We're seeing it more and more everywhere. And I think it's fantastic. I think we need to fight climate change on every level we can. And law is so powerful. And I also think a lot of it is about the narrative as well. And even if you don't think necessarily you will win the case or get the law in place or whatever it is, now you do obviously have to think about it strategically. And if you are going to lose and set a really bad precedent that might be in place for a long time, then you might not want to take that case. But it gives you a really good vehicle for conversations and for bringing it all out into the public and pushing politicians to do more. There's a really interesting different types of environmental groups. So you've some who are really much more extreme, which is great because that pushes, I guess, what we call the Overton window about what you can and cannot say, or not what you can and cannot say, but what sounds realistic to politicians, etc. The more radical people can be, the better it is, I think.
With COVID, there's this call to build back better, to not coming back to the previous normal. In your professional, personal circles, do you feel it's made some sort of change?
Personally, it's great because I get to spend a lot more time at home with my dog. But I guess planning to continue to do that. And I would never really thought about it before. And I do miss office friends and all the rest of it. But fundamentally than me spending time with my dog. I used to travel a lot because, as you can imagine, working on these international issues, there are all over the world. And I have such a guilt, and I should, obviously, about my emissions from all that travel, because it's just one of the easiest ways to impact the environment is to fly long distance, or even short distance as well. It was really difficult because if you don't go, then that environmental voice is not there, and that can be key to build relationships and talk to governments about what they should do, etc. But at the same time, if you go, then you emit it. And so now everything has gone online, and actually it's been great because I can now have one-to-one conversations with politicians or civil servants around the world, and they're willing to give that time. Whereas before I really caught them in like coffee breaks at the IMO and that. So that's been really helpful. I guess we'll see what impact that actually has, because the IMO at the same time suspended a lot of its meetings. Now it's going to start them virtually coming October, etc. So we'll see how they go. But also, I think it's just given everyone a chance to reset. Cycling has really boomed in the reduction. I mean, I guess I live in central London, so, this is very much my perspective, but the reduction in vehicles, etc., and everyone has been very pro that. Now we'll have to see what happens and how we can really lock that in. And I mean, governments will have to move quickly to do that before everything goes back to the way it was. But I'm really hoping that we can continue that and continue to fly a lot less. That's probably, to me, the greatest environmental benefit of COVID has been the reduction in flying. And if we can lock that in, that will have such a huge impact.
I'd like to talk a little bit about your gender, being a woman in that space. Have you ever experienced sexism?
I remember actually Justice Ginsburg from the US Supreme Court visited our university in Dublin and gave a speech, and somebody from the audience asked about sexism, how being a woman has impacted her, and whether Justice Ginsburg thought that our generation would have it so much easier and whether we would suffer from the same sexism. And I remember Justice Ginsburg saying, you might think you're fine now when you're sitting in university, wait until you get to the age where you might start having kids, and then you will see. And I remember sitting there at the time in university thinking, oh, she's so wrong. Sexism has gone so far. And I was so wrong. It really, like the law firm I was in Dublin, I remember one of the partners saying to me one day, sure, there's no point making a woman a partner because she's just going to go off and have babies. Like literally, like I didn't say anything to him then because I was so young, I guess, didn't know what to do. Similarly, I've seen it in the NGO world. I worked somewhere where there were different teams, and on each team there was a man and a woman, and the man was paid more. And I raised that, the way I raised that was wrong, and I would do that entirely differently now, but you live and learn. But I'm really proud that I did raise that, and it resulted in new salary scales. And I think it's just something we need to be aware of a lot of the time. Things I do now, shipping is a very male industry, and I even just small things like raising my hand at events and going, why aren't there any women on this panel? Things like that are really important. It's a really difficult one because we are definitely making progress, but it's slow, and it's also very difficult to know a lot of the time whether it really is sexism or not. And as long as it kind of looks like it, I think we have to be very, very careful and try and push the boundary. Because of that, in many ways, I mean, one of the things that I do, I'm very conscious of my management style and the people I work with, and I really want to be a really good manager. And one of the things as well I've really focused on is negotiation skills. Partly it's bread and butter of my job, trying to persuade governments to reduce emissions from shipping. I'm just so aware of how disadvantaged women are in the workplace and trying to get the wage or whatever. So I've kind of become a new person for a number of my friends when they're getting new jobs, they're trying to get promotions or whatever. I'm like trying to coach them through.
So do you have tips on how to approach a negotiation when you're a woman and you have to convince?
I find as a woman, it's very hard to be egotistical as you need to be. We've been taught, right? Even just from little societal cues, we're always supposed to put someone else forward, and we're supposed to be caring, and and that's great. And yeah, but there are certain times where you just have to put yourself forward, and you have to be able to recognize your worth. I am smart and brave and brilliant at a lot of things. And I've got amazing law degrees and economics degrees. And I have to really be able to own that. And it's taken me a while that I could even say it like that. And I think writing that down before you go into any negotiation and really thinking about it, okay, if this was my best friend and she had these qualifications, how would I say to her she should do this and what should she put forward? And I guess the other thing to say, and I find this difficult as well, is it's business, right? Even though I am in the charity and the NGO world, when it comes to salary and negotiations, it's not that I should have to accept some terrible salary just because I'm working for a charity. You should also get paid well and be able to support yourself and be able to have a lifestyle that obviously is little impact on the climate, but that is good because it's part of your value and your worth. And if you're not valued, you won't do your best for the climate and you won't do your best work. I think that's really important to also just be able then, when I, for example, I'm talking to senior people from different countries of the industry or whatever, to recognize my worth and my ability to do my job and my knowledge and all the rest of it, and really make sure I don't feel like I am lesser or not able or entitled to have that negotiation.
We talk more now about the toll of climate anxiety and despair on mental health. Have you faced this? And more generally, what helps you to remain hopeful for the future?
That's definitely something I struggle with. I guess what I do, so I've been working in climate for about 10 years, and what I do find really helpful now is the conversation has completely changed. 10 years ago, there was a lot more climate denial now. Not that it's completely gone, but in terms of Europe, it definitely has. And I remember a member of my family telling me that, sure, aviation isn't a problem for the climate. And I'm looking at this person going, what? How can you even believe that? Similarly, I remember a member of the European Parliament who I was speaking to, and he was a member of UKIP, which I don't know if UK listeners will know what that means, but I knew he was a climate denier, but I went in and spoke to him as I would to anyone else, because to me, I didn't want to talk down to him, to be honest. And if you're a climate denier, you're denying science, And he stopped me and said, oh, you obviously haven't done your research. You didn't realize that I don't believe in any of that stuff. And I was like, well, I did, but, I wanted to give you the benefit of the doubt. And I said, okay, well, even if you don't believe in climate change, let's talk about air pollution. This was on a shipping topic. And he was like, oh, yeah, I believe in air pollution, that type of science. And I thought it's incredible that you pick and choose what science suits you. And that's what climate denial is. But now there's no one who denies that. And even among those who believe in climate, everyone realizes it's really urgent. For example, Extinction Rebellion, Greta Thunberg, that kind of rhetoric is just so helpful, because now my job is not to convince people that something needs to be done. My job is convincing people that what we do has to be as ambitious as possible, has to have the maximum impact, etc. And so that's a really nice change. We can now see climate change. I'm sure you, based in Australia, like it's incredible. And even in London, the heat waves, etc. Partly I just try not to think about it too much. It's my day job, but at the same time, go for walks with my dog and get out into nature.
I just wanted to know your reactions on some articles I shared with you before this interview. And the first article was about Airbnb business model applied to conservation. And it was published in the Anthropocene magazine. I found it was quite fascinating. It relates the case of a program called Bird Returns. It's initiated by the American Nature Conservation Association. And basically what the program does is that it pays rice farmers to flood their fields for a few crucial weeks during the migration of those birds so that they can have access to the food they need. And basically they describe the model as a pop-up nature reserve. I was interested in your thoughts, comments on that initiative.
The point that stood out for me was it no longer has to be land for conservation versus land for agriculture, that you could actually bring both of them into one. And I think that's just such a great way to look at it. And I think we're going to need to do that more and more and more. And our use of land is just so important. And in terms of agriculture, unfortunately, like many other sectors, we don't have the right incentives. You know, unfortunately, a lot of the time farmers are incentivized to do things that have really, really detrimental long-term impacts on the environment. And so to the extent we can change that on its head, it's brilliant. So yeah, it's a really exciting initiative.
The second one has been published in Bloomberg Green yesterday, and it's an interview with degrowth economist Jason Ickel. He's actually an economic anthropologist at Goldsmiths University of London. For him, really walking away from the growth paradigm is the only way to live within our planetary boundaries. So to follow up on the article on the Airbnb type business model applied to conservation, that's probably something that Jason Ickel would think it's still too much of a compromise of trying to mix a very toxic practice in agriculture with favoring the environment somewhere in the way. What do you think of that radical? It's not so radical anymore. Actually, degrowth, we are starting to hear that more and more. And even Greta Thunberg, actually, although she'd never really pronounced the word degrowth, but in many occasions, she seems to imply that we really need to change the economic paradigm we are in to include those planetary boundaries. Is it something that resonates with you?
Definitely. And going back to, I guess, what I talked about before, you know, in the aviation shipping industry, saying how, you can't do anything to regulate us because we're so important for jobs and the economy and all the rest of it. And in that article, that point is made that, unfortunately, at the moment, we put GDP, so gross domestic product, the growth in that above everything else. And that's hugely problematic. And it's one of really interesting topics that are being debated a lot in economics and is growing more and more, because things your GDP can be things like wars or cleaning up pollution, whereas actually, you know, preventing the pollution in the first place would be much better, but that's not necessarily going to be reflected in GDP. So we need a much different, a different set of parameters. And in that article, he talks about looking at well-being, and absolutely, I would support that. And I think that's so important. And I think as well, coming back to your question about COVID, and it's kind of like a giant behavioral science experiment in many ways. And one of the things that I've been reading and hearing about is the impact of not being able to get outside and into nature, and how difficult that has been. And so actually, that is such a big part of our well-being. I'm really hoping that might translate into more emphasis on that. Ideally, right, you wouldn't have to pay farmers to, they would just, do the right thing anyway. And maybe one day we will get to that stage. But in the meantime, I mean, we need to stop the subsidies that are going to, rather than paying them for the good. I mean, the first thing to do, to my mind, would be to stop the subsidies that are encouraging them to harm the environment. And it's probably going to be a mixture of both. You know, it's like there's still lots of fossil fuel subsidies around the world, which is just incredible when you think about the climate emergency, right? But that's unfortunately where we are. I think we need to aim for the absolute ideal, but if there are things that work in the meantime, let's do them as well. As I've kind of said before, I'm one of those, I think let's do everything now and as much as possible.
At the International Maritime Organization, is there some consideration or some sort of initiatives to actually try to decrease the amount of the shipping activity, like the intensity of the shipping activity?
There's no discussion of reducing the amount of shipping that is done. Definitely not. What there is, though, is a big focus on reducing the emissions of shipping in the short term, so in the immediate term. The IMO has actually separated out policy options into short-term measures and mid to long-term measures. And the short-term measures are things that I spoke about before, such as slowing ships down, increasing efficiency, etc. And then the mid and long-term would be that switch to alternative fuels. My NGO focuses on that long-term switch, but there's quite a few great NGOs that are focusing on that short-term switch. Unfortunately, the negotiations are quite far ahead on the short term, and it doesn't look like it's going to be what we need. It will be something, but it could be a lot better. But it's not concluded yet. So I guess I always try and be an optimist. But as I said, there's a number of really, really great people who are pushing those regulations forward. So cross your fingers and toes that the IMO does the right thing on the short-term measures.
And to conclude, would you have a book, a film you would like to recommend to our listeners?
I guess it's a bit like Desert Island Discs. I was like, oh my God. I read about 200 books a year. So I like such a list of, anyway, yeah, but I'm going to recommend two, if that's all right. So one is my favorite book of all time, which is called Full Tilt, and it's by Dervla Murphy. She is an Irish travel writer, and in this book, she cycles from Ireland to India in 1963. And she is just so full of life, and also, I guess, there's no challenge too great, and she really enjoys nature and kind of shows how you can live with so little and how much joy adventure can bring. And she's just really badass and is just a great inspiration for me. So I just want to, I guess, recommend her to all of your listeners. The one that I want to recommend and really, really enjoyed and kind of made me see things in a new way is a book called Open Borders by Brian Kaplan. And it's actually a comic book on immigration. So it goes through why immigration is great for all economies, which is something I've always been. I mean, you know, I'm Irish and I've lived in Beirut and UK and Belgium and the United States, and I have benefited so much from all of that. And unfortunately, there's a huge amount of rhetoric, and this is also something that I think economics can be to blame for. Economics unfortunately allows narratives to grow about. There's a certain kind of size of the pie, and then immigrants are taking part of it, but that's not actually what it is at all. Immigration grows that pie. And I just also bringing back to the climate crisis, immigration is only going to grow. There's just no way around. Well, I mean, the way around that is to stop climate change immediately, right? But even if we stop tomorrow, unfortunately, we've already locked in quite a lot. And immigration is just going to be a huge part of our future. And we have such a moral obligation, if we are sitting in the developed world, to those that through no fault of their own, you know, I spoke before about the Pacific Islands who are facing for death. They're going to lose their homelands. It's really, it's appalling. And so I just think we really need to have a conversation about that all over the world and realize actually immigration is great.
Yeah, and rethinking our solidarity system. Yeah,
exactly.
Our values. Thank you so much, Aoife, for your words. And it was super interesting. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it. Thanks a million.
Thank you for listening. The full transcript of this episode and all the references mentioned during this interview can be found on our website, gosimon.org. This episode was kindly transcribed by Alicia Van Zyl. We'll see you in 2 weeks for our 20th episodes. Thank you so much for your ongoing support to our independent podcasts and to the great women voices we highlight fortnightly. Thank you.